Okay, welcome everybody to our workshop today, the What is Next for Citizens Consultation. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to moderate this workshop. And as you know, in recent years, institutions and governments at all levels have involved citizens more frequently in these participatory processes with different purposes, in some cases just to listen, in others to engage them in decision shaping or even decision making. Citizens' consultation are trending all over the world. Also, the United Nations wants to arrange a global conversation in 2020 at its 75th anniversary. So we have different institutional levels, like from local to international, and different approaches, like from listening to decision making. In this workshop, we want to learn from the practitioners and from the scientifics in order to find out how the future of this citizens' consultation could be shaped in order to make them a successful example of participation, notably in the context of the Conference on the Future of Europe, recently launched by the President-elect and the European Commission. But before we start all this, I would like first of all give you some practical information, and before that, of course, first of all introduce my speakers. So this is Doreen Groove. She leads the Scottish Government involvement in the Open Government Partnership. And on the left, I have Karine Bahr as a policy analyst in the OECD's Open Government Unit. And we are still awaiting Christophe Rion, the president of the Socialist Party Group in the European Committee of the Regions and mayor of Coulon. He's still at the airport or on his way from the airport here, so he will just pop in 1 second. So for practical information, I think you have been on several workshops already, so there will be interpretation provided from and into English and French, thanks to the interpreters on our back. There will be streaming on the session, and the timing will be, as you know from workshops too, that there's a short presentation of my colleagues, and then we will ask some Slido questions. So get out your mobiles, but put them on silent, please. And then we of course have Q&As. So think about what you would like to learn or to contribute to this. But before I give the floor to Doreen, I don't know how familiar you are now on this conference on the future of Europe that was proposed by President-elect von der Leyen. And there isn't, to be honest, there's not everything defined now. What we know is that it should start in 2020 and run for 2 years. It should bring together citizens, including a significant role for young people, civil society, and European institutions as equal partners. The scope and the objectives should be agreed between Parliament, Council, and the Commission. And von der Leyen also announced that she's ready to follow up on what is agreed, and including legislative texts and open to treaty change. So there is a scope of really change in there. And we can now discuss also how our ideas could feed into maybe this process to make, to enable to make this a good thing. And before now, I want to start and give Doreen the floor with a quote from Peter Altmaier. He's our economy minister in Germany, and he just wrote in an article that we need new formats in politics that go beyond tweets and enable a real discussion. And he really wants to engage citizens more in decision making. And then he said, I quote, but the translation is from me, from the German to English, so don't maybe be too hard on it. We need to be ready for real reforms, even if they hurt and if they go against our own interest. So that's really, I think, he should come to me. This is what you said to me at the beginning. So yeah, let's maybe have him heard you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that invitation to come. I am a civil servant, so I work for Scottish Government. But my background is as an archaeologist. I'm an archaeologist and historian, so I think in the very long term, and I mean really long term. And it feels really important to me that we look at the big context of what we're trying to do here. And the idea that our politicians across Europe from anywhere are going to easily give up power, I think we have to be able to support those that say they are. And I don't believe power is a zero-sum game. I think one of the really important messages to be able to get over today is in a world where we have such levels of complexity around all of the really big issues are intertwined. We need to have ways of understanding how they affect people and to take people with us because we all rule by consent. There isn't a single European government that doesn't rule by consent. So we need to make sure not just that we are providing the right thing, but that we are listening to the population. So what I wanted to do today, very, very briefly, in the 5 minutes I'm allowed, I can't.
I give you 7.
Do anything in 5 minutes. Is a tiny bit of background in that Scotland is a devolved authority within the UK, and I know someone in the UK talking about democracy feels tough for you all. But it's really core and current for us to really think about what democracy means. In Scotland, we have a reforming government, and we have had for the last 10 years. So we've done 2 or 3 really important things. One of them is develop a single set of outcomes, and that is this thing, which is called the National Performance Framework. It sets a set of 11 outcomes, but it also sets a set of values. And the thing I want to read to you this morning is about our values. We are a society which treats our people with kindness, dignity and compassion, respects the rule of law and acts in an open and transparent way. Our single purpose for all of public services in Scotland is to focus on creating a more successful country. With opportunities for all in Scotland to flourish through increased well-being, sustainable and inclusive economic, and we haven't quite got away from the growth word, it is there at the end. But the whole purpose of this is to drive how we work with people. That we will respect them and that we will work with them. So one of the examples I wanted to give you this morning, and you can look at it in here in more detail, and there are copies of the book thanks to Wolfgang and his team at the Committee of the Regions, is a set of experience that we had around a newly devolved power that came to Scotland in 2015, which was to deliver some of the social security benefits that we have. These were a whole range of different benefits, but what we decided at the beginning was that we had heard during an exercise we undertook in 2014, which was around what would a fairer Scotland look like, a national conversation that was run in a deliberative way around Scotland. And the main thing we heard from that people wanted to be treated with dignity. They wanted to be treated as individuals and have their voices heard. So when we got these new powers, we decided to try and apply that. The first thing we did was think about the shape of the benefits. We appointed a panel of 2,400 individuals who are in receipt of those benefits to work with us over 4 years in the development of the new system. So they were involved in quantitative and qualitative surveys. They have been involved in workshops. They have been involved with our user researchers who are designing both the very small elements of the actual forms and the way people interact with the developing service, but also the bigger picture. They helped us develop the legislation that went to our Parliament. Parliament looked across all of that information, looked at what was proposed and said, well, that's all very well, but actually there's nothing to hold you to account here. So they passed the legislation around the social security, but they also required us to put in place a charter of rights for the people in receipt of benefit. So what we did with that, rather than write that ourselves, was go back to our citizen panel and do a random selection weighted on the kinds of criteria to get a proper spread, and ask them to deliberate on what a Charter of Social Security rights would look like. So I use this example simply because during the development of our social security policy, we have used almost every bit of participation. We have used every method and every tried and tested route. And the point being, there isn't one way of doing things. The really important qualities you need is we need to be able to share information. Honest sharing of information is hugely important in a way that people can understand it. So information is power, and unless people have information, they can't be part of the deliberation in an effective way. We need to be able to give people time to think about what it is they're being asked to consider. And we need to do that in a way that is really effective. So one of the main messages I want to give today is that if we are thinking about, and we are in Scotland, how we put proper citizen involvement, and actually I'm going to question the word citizen. We have a lot of people who aren't necessarily citizens, and we don't want to exclude. We are very particularly inclusive where we can be. So I would change the word citizen to people. It's a bit kinder and a bit nicer. So where we want to include people in decision making, we are looking at a participation framework so that we can provide the tools and techniques for public servants. I don't know how many of you are public servants, but for those of us who are, we are the people that struggle with this. We are the people who would find it infinitely quicker just to make the decisions yourself, just to take the expert evidence and make the decisions. Of course it's quicker. It's not better. And it's not more effective. And we don't count the failures that has developed. We move on from that policy that didn't quite work, and we put it on our next application as something that we've achieved. Yeah, we've achieved it. It was awful, but we've achieved it. And people don't question that, whereas they do question the cost of bringing citizens or people into a room to deliberate properly. And if you're going to do that, we need to invest in the skills, not just within public service, but so much of the importance of this is around trust. If we don't, our population doesn't have trust in us, they won't engage with us properly. So having a neutral voice to be able to support whatever the action you're taking with your participants is really important. The skills in civil society need to be absolutely part of our thinking about how we invest in that whole system, because one-offs are of no use to man or beast. We need to think really properly right across the system. This is a different way of working. So participatory democracy absolutely is supportive of representational democracy. They are not in conflict. And indeed, it increases your tax take. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you very much for this great introduction here. So, so maybe from Karine, we can see you work for the OECD with reformers to strengthen stakeholders' participation, and we would like to know where the development is going and where the challenges are, and maybe take the point from Doreen that she said, well, participatory democracy is not against representative democracy, and that it can one feed the other. So is that also what you found out in your surveys, or is it something that is something on the practical side, or is it also on the scientific side? Well, we are keen to learn. Oh, you get the microphone.
Thank you very much. So from my side, what I wanted to touch upon is the fact that it's really important to recognize that despite various developments with regards to participatory democracy, there are still many challenges that exist. And I would like to just touch upon 4 of them as we speak. Is everything okay with the mic? No? Ah, you don't see it. Then maybe I should press on this. Ouais, c'est bon. Here we go. So the first challenge for me, the first really deep-rooted challenge is the representativeness of these participatory democracy exercises of citizen consultations. So what we find is that still today, very specific certain demographics are disproportionately represented in most of the things that happen. They tend to be male, older, white, well-off, well-educated, and urban. And so still often the issue is that there is a focus on how many people participate rather than who actually participates to some extent. Another key challenge is quality of input. So most of citizen consultations or participatory processes that we see, they're usually designed to get a sense of public opinion. So what people think about a certain topic rather than judgment or, as Doreen was saying, deliberation. Often this means that it doesn't require the persons that are being consulted to consider the trade-offs of certain, a piece of legislation or a piece of policy. And it's also more likely when we're asking people for their opinion generally, it's also more likely to lead to a sort of a wish list of often unimplementable suggestions. And what we found, the research that we've been doing at the OECD, is that most participatory designs are also likely to lead people to air out their grievances rather than really try to constructively find solutions. That was my second challenge. The third challenge that I want to share with you is individual versus collective engagement. And so a lot of participation opportunities that we see across OECD countries are designed in a way where people are asked what they personally think rather than putting themselves in another person's shoes or working collectively to find consensus and to find what would work best for a specific community. And then the last challenge that I want to share is sort of one-off. So a lot of these discussions sometimes happen as a tick-the-box exercise, where the decisions have been taken, and then we sort of try to add a participatory component to it. And there is little evidence that this type of processes actually lead to an increase in citizen trust in government or in the sense of people actually having a greater say in shaping the decisions that are affecting their lives. So more or less, we still struggle in different aspects and in different countries with these 4 challenges that I've mentioned.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karine. This is very interesting, and I think we will come back to the factors that influence a good consultation that could be then the next citizens consultation, and we will talk about these qualities in a second. But first of all, I think I would like to do the Slido question, if that is okay with you, and maybe you could now go to slido.com. And then hashtag EuropeCom. Yes. Careful, you can do it.
So session, they have to click on
the session 14. Yes, session 14. Okay, here on our panel is already working. I don't know, is it working for you? Yes? Okay. Well, then we can we ask the first question already? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So, well, you can see it. Okay, and you have already okay, so this is a very informed audience. So, have you heard about the conference on the future of Europe announced by the president-elect of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen? And okay, 2/3 have heard of it, but 1/3 has not heard of it still. So we can still do some more information here. Very good. The second question would be: would you be interested to take part in this conference? Well, it doesn't say here how much work that would be, but okay, this is that's another question.
Be interesting to know whether the no's are because they don't want to or they don't think it'll work.
Okay, is anybody who made a no and is willing to answer that question?
Anonymous, anonymous voting.
Is there? Okay.
I didn't press no, but I pressed I don't know, because when I think about the citizens consultation we had in the past, for instance, the ones we had on the road to Sibiu or on the initiative of Macron, we did some citizens consultation back home, which means for me the German-speaking community of Belgium, which is really small and easy to look at, as everybody knows everybody. And we often got the feedback from the people, actually, okay, so what's happening with the things we say? And I understand it's hard for the Commission or any other institution to actually track down every idea that has been said during these consultations and to then get back to the people and say, okay, you said idea A, B, C, and we did this with it. And I fear that depending on, also we don't know what's going to look at this new debate by Ursula von der Leyen. I fear that it's going to be another debate where the citizens just get more frustrated because they don't get the feedback they expect from it, or they hope to get it.
You have a very, very good point there. Doreen, do you want to go?
I couldn't agree more. I think it comes back to what I said. We need to invest in this properly if we're going to do it. And that means understanding the obligations on both sides. And having an honest conversation means setting out what it is that people are able to influence. There's never been a blank piece of paper. And there have never been bigger issues that face a government than those that are facing all of our governments now, the global challenges. So we need to be really clear about what the deliberation is about. And we need to have that feedback loop absolutely in place in an honest way. So at the beginning, you tell people how they will find out the information at the end, how that will be used. In our consultation process in Scotland, we have a website which says, we heard this from you. You told us this. This is the sort of aggregated evidence about it. And in the theory, we're supposed to write, and this is what we did with it. Very few of us ever get to this is what we did with it. And it's really important that we do. So it's a really strong point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And this really leads us to the second part, where we will try to find out criteria which were important to make it a successful criteria. But before this, I am very, very happy to welcome Christophe Rouillon. Thank you very much for joining us and making it possible to be here. He's the president of the European Socialist Group in the European Committee of the Regions and Major of Colin, as I said already. And I propose, because we were right in the middle of our little Slido, we have the last Slido questions. Then I would give you the floor to tell about your experiences with the Grand Débat, because this might also lead then to our second, let's say, part to say, okay, what can we now learn from all all these consultations we have been doing, not to do it like this, just like listening and not having representatives, not acting and giving an answer to it. So we will try to come up with some criteria then for the next, for the European citizens consultation, to make it a good thing. So then last question is, what is in your view the most important topic, because you were already talking about topics, and also which we could be discussed with the EU institution during the citizens consultation? Yeah. We have climate change. I could think about some others. Wow.
Just prove we're all wonderfully middle class.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this. I see, well, climate change is one of the most urgent issues, and we can maybe later talk about how this can be made, because you cannot say, what about climate change? You have to ask other questions that are more specific, maybe, and how could this make a good process? Maybe Karine, you can help us later to put some info there. Can we have them back, the question? Can we also come back to them later when we are in the discussion? That's great. So because there's also lots about values and social Europe, employment, and Doreen was already said, middle class. This is interesting because I was also waiting for migration, but I don't know if I don't see it here or if it's not there, but this is actually something that a lot of people, you know, a lot of people who are maybe not here because, but still are.
Migration, really important.
It's important, yeah.
And putting migration into a positive frame is really important. So I think how we deal with all of these really big issues, it should be there if we're honest about the things that people care about across Europe.
Okay, we will come back to this in a second. Because we will see how it has to be set up, the European citizens consultation. What topics can we then put into there, and how can we frame those topics? But first of all, I would like to give the floor to Christophe and tell us what you learned from the Grand Débat and what could feed into the European citizens consultation. Thanks very lot for being here.
D'abord, merci. Je suis en retard parce que...
Thank you. Well, I was in Berlin to organize a European network of small towns.
Autour des...
Yes, and it's also...
Voilà. Ne doit pas être...
Yes, it should not just be something for the big cities or big regions. Yesterday, it was the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we were talking about a Europe closer to its citizens. Anyway, at the Committee of Regions, we launched this citizens' dialogue and accompanied it with what was being done at the European Commission. Maybe you were all present, maybe you've also been organisers in the field for citizens' dialogues, so you are a bit the precursors of what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes. The big discussion, the big debate that was organised by Emmanuel Macron with a rather original way of proceeding. Basically, in Brussels, there was the meeting of European citizens who were randomly chosen. They met here for 2 days to try to decide about the questions that were going to be raised. Now, I was not directly involved as an organizer. I'm a mayor, I'm a European, and the organization is carried out it's done by the government through a committee that was set up in an ad hoc fashion.
You made also a consultation with citizens in Coulon, no? Didn't you?
Alors,
Coulon.
c'est un peu difficile parce que... Non, pardon. C'est que ça a tourné court. Le grand...
Oh, yes, well, the big debate lasted only 5 minutes, actually. We try to be good people and organize this, but honestly, the whole of France, they decided to organize these great discussions, grand débat. We saw what was decided at the national level. We decided to choose different themes with panel discussions. It was organized by sports organizations, youth organizations, and everyone could go to bring a contribution with slides, with laboratories, whatever. Anyway, on the day of the consultation, there was not a lot of people. There weren't crowds. Some of the Gilets jaunes arrived, and after 5 minutes they said, "We don't want any pre-organized discussions. We want to talk about everything." They took over the microphones. They started causing confusion. Anyway, the big debate lasted 5 minutes. But at that point, then, they didn't want to have any prearranged questions on participatory democracy, for instance, or no organized questions. So we pulled out a white piece of paper and everybody put on their comments. Some wrote proposals, but then after a discussion in the corridors with other Gilets jaunes, who came with a lot of claims that were not necessarily a question of a discussion. They were personal claims. The Gilets jaunes were not. In some cases, it was a lot of people who were being mobilized, but a lot of cases there were extreme left-wing people or extreme right-wing people with their own statements. Anyway, people did express their positions on this sheet of paper, but that's an interesting comment. But it's a question of fiscal justice. And here we saw in the field of, the way this was split, we saw different levels of responsibility. We saw that there were big companies, big groups who make their profits in Europe, but then don't pay their taxes in Europe. Anyway, there were quite a few panel discussions, but there were individual opinions that were expressed. And there were these questions, these points were written down, and then they were passed on to the prefect by the municipality. So in reality, it was not very well organized. I mean, it was organized at the start, but then during the consultation, everybody just spoke randomly. In other cases, there were discussions that were more structured with discussions, with exchanges through the atelier and through the workshops. I thought it was quite interesting to be able to get the opinions of the people in the field. And I think that would be something we could look at in the future. Basically, how can we sum up the situation so that we can organize a more structured discussion for the European institutions? I know that the questionnaire does look at where is the Europe for the European citizens. But we had about 40,000 responses from European citizens on questions that were really directly tied to European questions, such as, for instance, the powers of the European institutions and so forth. This questionnaire was set up by the Committee of Regions. It was based on an opinion of the Committee of Regions. It was co-signed by President Karl Lambert and the Vice President, and they were the basis for the document that was sent to the heads of state and government, and also to the President of the European Council. So the Committee of Regions was a bit of a trailblazer compared to what was happening in France. But in order to have a positive result, it should not be the consequence of a social discussion or of a protest. It has to be organized so that we, as citizens, can give our opinion on real facts, on real events, such as you mentioned earlier, for instance, sustainable development, social justice, the future of Europe. We need to be able to have not sort of all sorts of proposals, but something concrete that can be passed up towards the summit. For instance, how do you see that we can organize a permanent citizens' dialogue that should help us to go not only as far as the crisis or to cover the European elections, but to get the opinion of our European citizens on the ground so that we can strengthen our democracy and stop having Europe considered as an abstraction, that it's in Europe, but it's disconnected from the territory.
Interesting also like to see that on talking about the permanent dialogue. And maybe on this idea, I would like to get the panel first to give some two comments, but then open the floor also to your questions before in I don't know, around 15 minutes, I would like to come back to the mechanism, how it should be set up, such dialogue, and the topics. I will, but so that would be the rest of our session.
No, so just really quickly, Christophe mentioned a little bit some of the challenges that can be linked to when you're trying to open up and to engage in such citizen consultations. I've mentioned at the beginning some of the challenges that we've seen at the OECD from looking at different citizen consultation and participatory democracy processes. What we also see is a trend to sort of address these challenges, and a big part of this is through deliberative democracy. When we say deliberative democracy, what we mean is what Doreen, for example, presented. They often take the form of citizen assemblies or citizen panels or citizen juries, and they are designed to improve representativeness, lead to high quality informed recommendations, and engage people in a way where they strive for consensus through deliberation. My colleague at the OECD, Claudia Schwalis, is working on a forthcoming study of deliberative processes used for public decision-making internationally. They're doing a really interesting job of looking at close to 600 examples at all levels of governance of deliberative democracy exercises. And the preliminary data shows that these types of processes are not new. They've been used since around the 1970s. And they've really taken off since 2010, more or less. This year, we have seen a huge spike in such exercises. To the best of our knowledge so far, and this is an ongoing process, there are are 38 initiatives of deliberative democracy that have been completed already this year, and another 26 are currently underway. And another key point that I wanted to mention is also that what we were seeing is an increasing salience of the question of institutionalization, which also Christophe mentioned a little bit. How are we embedding these processes so that they're not a one-off and they don't happen at a time where they're just maybe often not useful or not useful enough? And different approaches have been tried. We see a combination of deliberative processes happening sometimes before referendums in a number of countries. Or another example is, and that we've seen, is the ability to petition with enough signatures to force a certain governing authority to commission a deliberative process before a specific time frame. So what I just wanted to share with you is the challenges that I presented earlier, but also some of the key trends. And the key trends, what we see, that it's not just what that, I mean, the title of the sessions is what's next for citizen consultation. So it's not just participatory democracy, but it's participatory and deliberative, and this part of the term is really important. And the trend that we see is that we're moving towards a more permanent and coordinated approach to citizen participation.
Thank you very much, Karine. This is very interesting. Do you want to go directly towards Christophe's intervention?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Christophe. I think everything you said leads me to absolutely agree with your final point, that we need to do this better. It's not, we're learning. This is a new way of doing our business, and recognizing that our populations no longer entirely trust the elites to get on and do it ourselves. So we have to recognize that this is about rebuilding a bit of trust, and that means properly setting out a system that will work in order to do this. We have to invest in institutions that are training public servants, that are training civil society hosts. One of the most important elements, and you described the exercise in the grant about falling apart because the structure wasn't there. Actually, the facilitation skills in order to take a deliberative assembly through a particular issue are hugely important, and they are quite rare. I never facilitate. I'm far too opinionated. So you need to have people who understand what those skills are. You need public servants to be smart commissioners. You need to be able to think about and invest in the skills to have them in right across our system. That means building that. It means thinking about really what is the question that you're asking people to be involved in? What is the method that will get us there? And that won't always be deliberative. Online consultation, and we see participatory budgeting rising around the world. Open Government Partnership in particular has been driving the development of participatory budgeting. People understand that money is important, so it is a really good way of getting people involved. So we need to look at having the skills, the expertise, and the understanding, not just amongst the people who are delivering this, but also recognize what it does for people. Because actually, if any of you have been involved in a really deep deliberative exercise, the participants come out of it changed. They learn, they recognize that they have, most people go into a citizen assembly or a citizen jury thinking they know very little. Why have you invited me? Oh, I'm not sure I can participate. And come out with confidence and having felt that for the first time somebody's actually asked them and that their opinion was valuable. And you can't measure that kind of thing, but actually it's hugely important. So there are benefits for everyone here. And it absolutely has to be done well, because if we do it badly again and again, it will just be the last shiny thing and be put to one side. And we will go again to the same people making the same decisions and getting it wrong and moving on to the next. So it is about thinking about what we need to put in place. And the conference is a really interesting example of where we can begin to think about what we need for that. So investing in it over in the next year or so, but also thinking what would be the legacy of that. So in each area of the EU, how do we put in place the structures that are going to be able to support that for local issues, for regional issues, for looking at just transition? Most of Europe is facing a really difficult set of questions around the just transition from a high carbon economy. We need to be really thoughtful about that, but we need to do that with our people. So this is our method.
Okay, thank you very much, Doreen, for this. I would like to give the floor now to the question to the floor. If there is any questions that rise here, and exactly, and please.
Hello, I'm Laurent Tenberger from Pulse of Europe. I have one question for the panel, in particular after Mr. Rouillon showing the disruption by the yellow vest of the event organized by the city. My question to you is, would you trust civil society themselves to organize participatory formats? Thank you. Mr. Rouillon, for example?
Well, yes. Civil society, that's quite a vague concept. You're probably talking about associations, big NGOs. I don't get the impression that I'm not part of civil society as an elected representative, but I think that's another debate. But I think we have to work in partnership in order to really keep democracy alive every day and continuously so. I don't think we should have this distinction between civil society and elected representatives. Obviously, we have 5 years ahead of us now. We're talking about European questions. We've got 5 years to rebuild confidence and trust vis-à-vis this growing populist movement that's invaded Europe. And I think the organisation of the citizens' dialogue is a way of doing that. It's a way of moving out, opening up. We have an increasingly digitalised society. That's positive in some aspects, but negative in others, because it's given people a platform to say anything and everything. You know, there are things going on everywhere that are quite shocking. You know, in Italy, for example, there are politicians having been put under police escort for their own safety because of threats they've received. So I think we need to try and arrange and organise something, and civil society is probably a very good intermediary, a very good broker, if you like, an in-between, to try and bring together contacts between the institutions and citizens, because it's not always easy to organise these dialogues, and quite often the institutions are not trusted to organise these events. I think, though, the real question is how can we get our citizens to accept the fact that what we are saying will not just be empty words or hot air. And I think the Committee of the Regions, in the framework of some kind of permanent citizens' dialogue, can work hard. You know, if we could have 2 or 3 topics, for example, territorial cohesion, local investments for sustainable development, for example, or for digitalisation, the fight against climate change. We could take those specific topics and have a discussion or a debate on them, and on the basis of that discussion, we could come up with proposals that could really serve as the basis for the Committee of the Region's own initiative opinions That would then allow those proposals coming from our citizens to get into the whole circuit of policy-making proposals at European level. We have 3 tasks in the Committee of the Regions. We can either comment on the Commission's proposals, or we can take the own initiative and make comments on legislative proposals, and that's what I've done in the past as well. But I think if we can use the citizens' dialogue to feed back our citizens' proposals and comments into the legislative circuit, the legislation-making circuit at European level, that will be a really good thing. And hopefully the Committee of the Regions for the future conference on the EU could also have an increased or more visible role when it comes to the legislation-making process here. So we could start with the citizens' dialogue, and then it can start out on the ground, and we can pass those comments and proposals back up through the hierarchy, as it were, and get those comments to the European institutions. We can also work with the European Parliament on this to try and rebalance things. Because I think at the moment, the current system is more focused on the state level. I think we seem to be working more towards a confederation of states at the moment, and we're losing this kind of community spirit. So perhaps we should try and address this imbalance. I mean, I understand to a certain extent the Gilets jaunes that came to Cologne and said, you're just imposing all of this on us, and you come in with your own ideas. I can kind of understand their position in a way, but I think if we, as the Committee of the Regions, manage to organise something which is a structured debate, because we can't talk about everything and anything, that's just not possible. But if we can manage to structure this in such a way that we can channel citizens' replies and comments up to the European institutions, I think that will help us build or rebuild confidence of our citizens in the European institutions, and can also bring Brussels, Strasbourg closer to our countries and our citizens as well.
Maybe an option also. I think there has been in certain, they were also certain communes were also given the money, and this could also be the money from the ERDF or whatever, to decide for themselves where they want to put the money. So that could also be one of these kind of options. But I want to give take two more questions, please.
I once followed a course in change management, and the main lesson that I took out of it was that those initiatives often fail because they immediately go to step 3, an action plan, and without forgetting to get a common ground and people on board. And I'm a little bit afraid that initiatives like this are the same. We immediately go to the action plan, we go to have a dialogue. But we forget that people, there is a crisis in democracy. People have all individual opinions, and they say, well, that politician is not doing what I want, so politicians' democracy is bad. So I think we should start with a European Year for Democracy and explaining what democracy is about. It's about having different opinions, having to find a consensus, as Corinne said, and people to accept that perhaps their opinion is not a majority of opinions. And only then you can start with dialoguing, and then see when there is this common ground, when there is a common agreement on what kind of society we want, the basic values, and then only then we can go and see what in that context can be proposed with the choices we make with the budget and things like that. Thank you. I think that's a question for all three.
Am I allowed to disagree? I think you're making an assumption that people need to be taught what democracy is. And I think I'm not entirely sure that I agree that there is one version of democracy that's right, which is why I think there's no reason why we couldn't run a year of European democracy alongside a conversation and having that discussion with what people think democracy is and how they would want our democracy to build actually is, for me, is part of that, what the President is seeking to achieve. She might not be, but it's perhaps what we all would quite like her to achieve. I don't think they're in contradiction, but I don't think we have the answer for what democracy is. So going out with an information campaign is definitely not. It should be a debate. Well, I think that's kind of where we are, and it would be one of the big questions that I would see as we saw on the word cloud, the future of democracy, what does it mean and what is compromise? All of those elements need to be within the discussion, because if we are going to deal with some of the really big issues, we need to understand where power lies, who has it, and how it is exercised. And I think there's quite a lot of shifting needing to be done for people to be able to understand that. We have a review of governance in Scotland at the moment, and it is really quite interesting how difficult it is to find out where decisions are made that affect you. We kind of never thought about it before, but actually who makes the decisions around justice, around any of the elements? So having that information much more transparent, all join open government partnership and just push openness and transparency.
Yeah, perhaps just to say that what we've heard from the gentleman's question, but also a little bit from Christophe, is that it might be difficult for people to engage in participatory or deliberative processes when they do not trust the system. And so my understanding of your sort of comment is that, how do you do this in parallel? Do you first regain trust and then engage in a conversation where people will trust that you will be using their opinions and deliberations effectively, and you will actually make changes based on what you hear, or is it a communication exercise that's happening? And which leads me to my sort of another announcement that I wanted to make is that I think many of you in the room might be public communicators working specifically on communication, and these are very different worlds. Communicating is one thing, and also engaging people and deliberative processes can be a different kind, but more and more we see that these two worlds are intertwined. At the OECD, we're launching next year the first global report on public communication, and a specific chapter will be about how are we communicating around participation processes. How are we informing people that this is taking place, and how are we telling them what's in it for them? How are we incentivizing these people and saying, if you give us your time, sometimes, Doreen, you said it was over 2 years, sometimes it takes 4. It's not a one-off, you come in one day to the mairie and discuss things and go back home and that's it. If we're really trying to regain trust through deliberative processes, this will take the citizen time, and for that person to invest time, are we communicating what's in it for them? Why are they even supposed to be doing this? And what will come out of it? And how will we provide feedback? And so there are a lot of different ways that we're looking at it, and many OECD countries have good practices to share, and I hope I'll have more information for you next year.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you'll be next year here again. You're booked. Is there another? I have room for one more question. Oh yes, please.
I'm interested about the question of selecting the topics. So I understood from several interventions that it's important to have specific topics. And I had the feeling, I'm French, and during the Grand Débat, one of the main criticism, and myself, I did not participate in the online part, because many people had the feeling that when you went through the online opportunities, then you had very oriented questions, and you couldn't really put on the topics that you would think personally are more important. So how do you manage when you organize a citizen consultation to first make people accept that you cannot bring anything on the table, because maybe thinking about the EU level, maybe we don't have the competences or those kind of questions. And I imagine it can be hard for people to accept that they cannot bring anything to the table. And how do we balance between keeping it open so that everyone can intervene, and maybe with different point of views, where while not going into that other extreme of really focusing the questions too much? Thank you.
Chers compatriotes.
Well, fellow French citizen, I heard that you're French. But you know, the best way of showing your Frenchness, I think, is to speak your native language French, especially when we have interpreters in the room. It's such a shame that French people here, when they come here to Brussels, don't speak French. You do speak very good English, of course, but when I do hear people speak in English when they could speak their mother tongue, I find it a bit of a shame. But anyway, never mind. On to your question. Yes, of course. When the Gilets jaunes came to Cologne, they didn't want to just speak about the 3 topics that we had identified. Everybody wants to speak about their own topics, and that's why we changed things and we went back to a blank sheet, if you like. We have before us now this opportunity of the Conference on the Future of Europe being proposed by President-elect von der Leyen. And we're now trying in the Committee of the Regions to think about how we are going to fit into this discussion. It's a discussion that will perhaps last for a year or 2 years, to look at how we can reform the EU. And I think we also have to draw lessons from the last exercise of this kind, the Convention on the Future of the European Union, which led to the treaty that was rejected the first time by referendum in France, and was also rejected in the Netherlands by referendum. Now, why did it fail? I think it was because it wasn't shared, it wasn't understood. It was work that was carried out at a national committee. There were Valéry Giscard d'Estaing who was leading that, but it wasn't really shared by your average European citizen. They didn't feel involved. And I think now we have to think about how we can have a real discussion on this. But the thing is, we need to have specific comments, otherwise we're just going to get lost. And of course we need to have deliberative democracy, this idea of talking together, finding compromises, respecting each other's views. I mean, it's not just a shouting match that you hear sometimes on radio talk shows. Citizens, I think, need to be involved, but citizens can also learn from this themselves as well. And I think civil society organisations also need to learn, I think, how to organise these debates in a structured way so that we can actually come out with a positive outcome for everybody. Because if you don't have a structured debate, you can end up going in all kinds of directions and losing kind of control of the discussions itself. Now, carrying out the discussions in local areas, in town halls, in municipalities, so that the local authorities can be involved and the citizens can be involved in this idea of Europe is very important. And coming up with proposals that citizens can identify with. And that I think that's the best way to act, rather than having proposals made at the top and being channeled down. We need to work the other way around. So that citizens really feel understood and listened to, and also so that they can identify with the proposals being made. So I think that's really is the heart of the matter here. And your question is very valid. I think we need to pick 2 or 3 major topics and have then a very broad debate on those.
As usual, I'm going to contradict that. I kind of agree, but I kind of also think we need to be pretty clear on what it is we are asking people to be involved in. So in our participation framework in Scotland, what we've done is pull apart the bits of work that governments do, and absolutely the idea of that initial vision. We've got 2 years for the conference. There's absolutely a period of visioning where the vision of what the future of Europe should look like needs to be broadly discussed. That doesn't need to have a set of really distinct topics. That can be online, it can be deliberative, it can be part of the system that we develop in order to set out what will come before the conference. But what we've done is set out visioning as an exercise, the development of a policy or a project as one element that could involve deliberation, appraisal or accountability, decision-making. There will be very few times when the EU will ask its citizens to be decision-making, but it ought to be really clear about that. Implementation, people being involved in holding power to account. So thinking about that as one element of how we take forward participation, and evaluating whether or not it worked. So thinking about that feedback loop that we heard about earlier, it's about getting a system right. Putting that in place so that people can begin to track what this debate is talking about, having really effective communication. It's not very often you hear me say that, because I actually think deliberation and communication are really pretty different things. But in this case, that's really important. Communicating the message that this isn't a one-off thing, that this is part of a journey that we're all trying to take together. And these are the places that you can feed in effectively. And we would like to hear your voice at this point about the broad picture. As we go through, together we will refine that and we will develop it.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Is there any other question? Otherwise, okay, yes.
Thank you very much, all of you. We've been very much discussing the ideal situation for citizens' consultations here, but the reality is we don't live in an ideal world. And one issue that I don't have an answer to is the fact that the people at the top tend to have values which are very about top-down management and retaining control, and yet they are the decision makers when it comes to opening up government. So we can talk about the ideal situation where there needs to be a commitment right from the start about how consultations will be taken into account, what follow-up there will be. But getting those people to commit to it, there's a values clash. So that's for the big things. And even for small things, the other participant mentioned frustration with an online platform, which is already too channeled and not deliberative and open enough. These kinds of decisions are taken by people whose values are about retaining control, about having a rigid structure, about not opening up, really. So how do we square the circle?
Il faut accepter de se mettre un peu en danger. C'est vrai que si on...
We have to accept the fact that we're going to be running risks. It has to be done. I understand your frustration, but at the same time, it's necessary to have a certain level of organization. It's difficult. The microphone, please. The microphone's disappeared. Yes. I'm afraid that this discussion, the conference on the future of Europe, will end up being a discussion between heads of states and government, and then just to amuse the audience. There won't be a real debate. It'll be managed by algorithms, and at the end of the day, there won't be any result. Now, we've got to stop. I'm asking the French people to speak French and to speak their own language and not speak English, because they'll really, at least they'll be able to express things in properly instead of using bad English. I'm promoting multilingualism in Europe, especially when you have to communicate in public. People want you to speak to them in their own language.
question, il faut effectivement.
Oh, I think we've got to move away from this digital democracy. Of course, digital will reach a large public, but it won't help the debate at the local level. And if you are communicators, I don't know what your profile is, but if you work for municipalities at a local level, you've got to work there. Over the next 2 years, we're going to work in the field, and we need to, and the questionnaires are a way of expressing individual opinions, which will have to be then compared, managed by AI, which is not really intelligence. It's just a way of classifying information. And then the decisions, the discussions, is a way of advancing ideas and drawing out ideas that maybe did not appear at the beginning. Now, as far as the European institutions are concerned, just 1 minute here. Europe is a real democracy. We criticize Europe too much, actually. I'm not talking only of France. I mean, in France, for instance, a law is made in a week and you can't discuss it. Whilst at the European level, there's all sorts of discussions, exchanges, it's put to the stakeholders. At the end of the day, everybody is consulted. Quite simply, is the citizen consulted? Well, he is through various representatives and NGOs and lobbies and whatever. We've got to find a way of associating citizens better. I've written a book about this. You could be able to find it. But we're trying to bring these new elements, because when you criticize the political system, the European system, you're going a bit too far. I'm all for constructive criticisms. A representative democracy is the most fantastic thing that was invented. Only today we have to renew it, regenerate it, and make it compatible with today's appetite for opening up information for the participation of citizens. And people are a lot more informed than in the past.
This? No? No. Okay, short intervention, so we can maybe take another question then.
Very short. Of course, you're right. You're asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. And the thing is that turkeys now recognise that Christmas is valid. And I think we are beginning to see right across the system an acknowledgement that trust in government and institutions, ever since the financial crash, actually has been dropping. It isn't an accident that that trust is something that's fragile. And we're seeing really big global issues. So I agree that the EU institutions are indeed democratic, but that still hasn't made them trusted. So I think rather than contesting these things, acknowledging them and trying to build on the roots that we have, using advocacy in order to get at the people who are the influencers. I was in a workshop yesterday, which is we were all influencers, aren't we? Which was fascinating. And we are. So you all have a right to go to your MP, member of the European Parliament, to say, actually, I want to be involved in this. So being passive is allowing that to continue. So if we are, if we want to see participative processes that properly support our representative democracy, then we have to ask for it, and we have to take part in it, and we have to be activists in that.
Thank you very much. And maybe from, I'm only the moderator, but I wanted to tell you that indeed I mean, now politics recognizes it. And the quote I gave you from, I mean, it's the economy minister of Germany. It's not nobody, I'd say. And he says we need to be ready to real reforms, even if they hurt and if they go against our own interests. Then this, Turkey Christmas thing is starting to work. And it's a process. And we were here before, and we were talking about consultation where people listen and whatever, and we are already now next step. Now you see this, but fight for it. But I want to take the two questions now together, give the panel the opportunity to answer, and then go a little bit on three. Okay, three questions. The questions first, and then we answer in one. And
Microphone, please.
three questions first, then we answer in one, and then we give a word at the end, where we please come to the methods again and to the topics. Yes, in your last word.
I'd like to add something to the question, and then it is also in addition to previous conversations. I used to work in government communications, but I'm more into behavioral insights now, and the major insights told by David Halpern, the director of the British Behavioral Insights team, is that behaviors shape attitudes and not the other way around. And so to me, the answer to that question might, for instance, be practice more, do more exercises in participatory processes, because it shapes the attitude. It convinces people that it actually works, that it's valuable. Rather than organizing communication and trying to reach people, which is difficult, then trying to convince people, which is difficult, especially if they're in another bubble than your own bubble, do something together. Rather than go top-down, cognitive, and all those things that no longer work because everyone's just obliterated attention-wise, do something that shapes attitudes. For instance,
Okay, thank you very much. There was another question here.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais parler en français.
Thank you. I'll speak French then. But I'm Spanish. I'm Spanish. Unfortunately, no Spanish. So, anyway, I really support you. We would have liked to see the German, English, French, Spanish, Polish, all the languages. My name is Teresa Siles. I'm advisor for land policy at the permanent representation in Spanish permanent representation here in Brussels. And I'd like to ask a question here. The second part of citizens' consultations. If you're in a certain environment today, it's communication. Now, it seems as if we keep talking about dialogue. We've got to keep talking, having dialogues. But at the end of the day, how do you manage things? When you make decisions, when a government makes decisions, you've got to make choices. So I imagine you take some proposals, but not all of them. So how can we manage the frustration of people who don't see themselves represented in the decisions made by their governments? That's the question, really. Because this shows a lack of trust, because people say, I said, I was shouted, I tried, but nobody does anything about it.
Merci beaucoup pour votre
Thank you for your question.
last question here, and then we answer.
Microphone again, it's gone. Microphone.
You will have only 1 minute in order to have a last round of your, and there I want you to answer the question. Okay, thank you.
Hi all, my name is Joe, I come from Malta, and I have to speak in English so that I'll be understood by all. So I refer to the conference on the future of Europe by going back to the citizens' consultations, because in our country the message was, we will be holding the citizens' consultations, and we were really involved in the organization of such consultations in view of the new strategic agenda, which was adopted by the European Council last June. But we compiled a report, and we were told that it would be sent to the European Council for considering kind of taking into consideration the concerns, the aspirations of the people into the strategic agenda. I search for the Council conclusions and find the strategic agenda, and if I'm not mistaken, I don't find a reference to any of any reference to the exercise. So it would have easily been highlighted that the four main pillars of the strategic agenda, protecting citizens and freedoms, developing a strong economy, building a climate-neutral, green and social Europe, promoting European interests and values on the global stage, these are the conclusions taken from the citizens' consultations. I think that would have been a real big point that the citizens' consultations led to somewhere. Now, in view of the Conference on the Future of Europe, I think it would still have to be established how it will be done. I think the main point, what is most important, is not the how, but the what and the why. Why are we doing this? Where it will be leading to? And that's, I think, the main point to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry for cutting a little bit short here. Okay.
Aujourd'hui, les élus qui gardent la confiance.
Nowadays, the people who are still elected officials that are still trusted are mayors. So really, you must decentralize throughout Europe with questions, subjects chosen locally so that they can trickle upwards. I agree entirely with a colleague from Malta. Heads of states and government, you must stop not listening to citizens, must stop defending only their national interests. They've got to consider also the interests of their citizens and the interests of Europe. And I've got great concerns about the European budget and how we can respond to what citizens want. The prices are blocked. We're talking about 1%. 1% of the GDP goes to the EU. How can you block this 1%? And then if this is blocked, how can we finance things for the citizens? We've got to discuss these things at the basic level. And at the Committee of Regions, we've got to organize these debates throughout Europe. It's not just a question of summing up the concerns of individuals or of member states. No, we've got to find a way of making Europe grow. And we've got to face the rest of the world and the Chinese and the Americans and so forth.
On behavioural insights, yes, practice makes perfect. Couldn't agree more. How do we make decisions on difficult questions? I suppose the example I would use is in Ireland, where two successive citizen assemblies looked at some of the biggest, most toxic decisions that ministers simply couldn't look at. So they looked at abortion and same-sex marriage, and the deliberation around those was very careful. The evidence was presented. They came up with solutions which, though they weren't binding on the legislature, in the end, the politicians could say, well, we would never dare tackle this, but look what the population has said, and changed radically the way Irish politics worked. So I think that's an example where it can work. Conference of Europe, Yeah, of course we should be connected and people should see the feedback. They absolutely ought to be able to connect what came, what their contribution led to. That doesn't mean every comment from every single person across the EU is going to be in a new strategy. Of course it isn't. But people, of course, need to be able to see why and understand what the trade-offs are. Part of this is about having a much more intelligent debate. It's about giving people the information that they, so they can understand where those trade-offs have gone and why they've happened. So I agree.
Yeah, no, just to go back to some of the questions, I mean, I think there's no going back in the sense that whether it's governments or institutions, they can decision makers, they can no longer afford to continue sort of a top-down management approach. I mean, we're seeing it more and more in countries across the world. It's not working, and you will see that, you know, taking these decisions just from one side of the authority is not working. So the idea is that progressively, with a number of initiatives like the open government, culture that's going on, you cannot. I mean, it's only a matter of time, basically, that we really reach through, somewhere where participation becomes the new normal, in a sense. And yes, I agree with many of the points that were raised on the purpose, on engagement and how we see, when citizens have actually taken the time to participate in polls or to participate in consultations. At the end, what I think is that the clear issue is that the purpose of the engagement should be really the focus. What is the problem that we're trying to solve, and how will engagement help solve it? How will a consultation help solve it? How will a dialogue help solve it? And then the sequencing of it is also essential. So there are a number of elements, and this is an extremely difficult process, but we are getting there. And Doreen shared some extremely useful lessons learned and good examples that where we can start building. What are some of the criteria that can really help get this through?
Thank you very much. So we are more or less at the end of our session, and I said I will give you another minute. It will count down to 30 seconds. But I wanted just to wrap up and say we did find out some factors that make some of these discussions fruitful. And we said we need to select participant by random lot, because otherwise, as we saw here, there were themes that didn't even come up, where a lot of people are really, were important for them. We need methodologically to move from this agenda setting to specific issues and solutions, and not otherwise they would be just talking and giving their opinions on everybody. But we need to come up with concrete agenda setting. Involve, of course, experts, because we need to have the input, what you were talking about, also the input. And structure also, that was an important thing, I think, to ways to avoid polarizing debates, but that people are not like, I want, but they have to find a solution, for example, for how can we reduce climate change, and then they have to find together a solution and not only push out throughout their point. And of course, getting public authorities then to commit to this participatory forums and forms. So I think we have put up a setup of these things, and in the next round at a 11:15, there's also a session on how to organize a citizens consultation. So if you want to go there, please do so. The other thing which I promised was to talk about the topics, and we had the topics. And there, I mean, we cannot solve everything in 1 hour and a half. But I think there was this problem. On the one hand, if you have those consultations, you have to be specific on they have to find solution for a specific issue, as also Doreen was saying. On the other hand, of course, we not need to close it down at the beginning. So this has to be maybe discussed in another round or in another year, next year. So for my, I will give you another 30 seconds for each panelist, please. No, for 30 seconds are cut. So then it's another 30.
Il faut donner de la chair, de l'humanité à l'Europe.
We've got to beef up Europe somehow and give it more humanity. It's a wonderful machine. it's created 3,600 directives. We've got this wonderful mechanism to distribution of funds and so forth, but we've got to move on. And I think that today citizens have to understand that it is not Brussels who decides, it's our citizens, and we've got to be organized at the Committee of Regions so that we can really get the citizens' proposals to trickle upwards, a bit like messages in a bottle. And we've got to have some real priorities and beef up this European citizenship. And I think this would be the best way to fight populism and those who've been trying to destroy our institutions. And so this is the real reorganization. The debate is productive, but the the Committee of Regions has to move further, and we've got to have a conference on the future of Europe.
Thank you. I think I agree with what you said. I think that we need to get down to developing a working group that will actually deliver this. You can talk about it for as long as you like, but unless there are people who are actively thinking about how we make this happen, both for the Conference of Europe, and I wouldn't dream of setting the topics now, whatever we've said on a word cloud, it feels to me that that needs to be really carefully thought through, and it needs to be very widely discussed. So comms does come into this. We need to get the message out that actually this is a conversation that we want people to be part of. I think absolutely putting in place the investment and the infrastructure in order to do it. And I would invert the triangle. I really don't like this idea that the president is at the top of a hierarchy. We are all, as public servants, whether we're elected or we're employed, we are there in order to serve the people. So the people should be at the top of the triangle.
That's a great last word. We are here to serve the people. With this, I would like to thank again, first everybody who came and asked questions and was interested in the panel. And the panel, of course, very much thank you. And not to forget at all the interpreters. They're doing a wonderful job, especially when my English and not my native language is so bad. But so they have a hard time. I would like just to give you the hint for the next session, how to organize a citizens consultation, which I already said. Please, if you Twitter, if you use the hashtag EuropeCom. And don't forget, there are these books where there's more input, food for thought, and they're out there. And there's also Doreen's...
and it's really good.
Yeah, how can it be? Thank you very much.